Hmm. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, The Conscience of Democracy. This is the second in a series of webinars highlighting the educational challenges that inspired FAIR's American Experience curriculum and celebrates America's upcoming 250th anniversary. I believe it's the semi-quincentennial. That's a tongue twister. Uh, I'm Monica Harris, Executive Director of Fair for All, and I'm delighted to host tonight's important conversation about the roots and the future of American pluralism. And this evening, I'll be joined by two remarkable thinkers and members of FAIR's own Board of Advisors, Nadine Strawson and Professor Robert George. In an era where political opponents are increasingly viewed as enemies and when social media algorithms reward outrage over understanding, and when ideological bubbles insulate us from challenging perspectives, this conversation couldn't be more timely and urgent. Tonight will remind us that before we can tackle any of our current challenges, whether it's inequality, polarization, institutional trust, or lack thereof, we must first reclaim our capacity to engage productively with those who see the world differently. As we celebrate our nation's approaching 250th anniversary, we're not just looking backwards at what our founders have accomplished. Instead, we're moving forward and looking ahead towards today's Americans and applying those same foundational principles to solve our current problems. Lastly, I want to remind everyone that, again, that tonight's conversation is aimed at supporting our curriculum, and it's another plug for our curriculum. It's a comprehensive social studies course that helps high school students appreciate and understand that throughout our nation's history, Americans have used our foundational principles to bridge differences, overcome challenges, and to create a more perfect union. So with that, I'd like to introduce tonight's first guest, Nadine Strawson. She's a New York Law School professor emerita and past national president of the American Civil Liberties Union. She's also a senior fellow with FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, and she's a leading expert and frequent speaker and media commentator on constitutional law and civil liberties. She's also testified before Congress on multiple occasions. Our second guest, Robert George, is the McCormick Professorship of Jurisprudence and director of the James Madison Program on American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. That's a mouthful. He has chaired the U.S. Commission of the International Religious Freedom and Commission on International Religious Freedom, and served on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and the President's Council on Bioethics. He is a judicial fellow at the U.S. Supreme Court, where he has received the Justice Thomas C. Clark Award. So with that said, I'd like to dive into our exploration tonight of how we keep the conscience of democracy alive in these polarizing times. Nadine, I'd like to start with you, and I'd like to focus on the founder's vision. Or actually, you know what? Let's take a step back. Robbie, we're going to give you first crack at this. Let's do this. Let's do this.
I'm old-fashioned. I believe in the ladies' first principle. But go ahead.
I like that. So, Robbie, our founders created a system of checks and balances, partly as a safeguard against mob rule or mobocracy, as one of our FAIR members noted. So, in your opinion, how do we distinguish between healthy democratic debate and tyranny of the majority opinion?
Well, first, let me say, Monica, that it's just a blessing for me to be on with two dear friends and champions of truth-seeking civil discourse, and champions indeed of the First Amendment and our precious right to freedom of speech, a right that's under pressure now, not just from one side of the political spectrum, but from people on both sides of the political spectrum. It seems that as soon as one side or the other gets power, they lose their memory of what they had previously said about freedom of speech. But Monica Harris and Nadine Strawson are two people who stand on principle, no matter who's in power, and stand up for the rights of everyone to express their opinions. Monica, you're right. Our founders were concerned about self-government because they were worried that self-government can turn into the rule of the mob. That's why, for example, they deprecated the term democracy. We embrace the idea of democracy, right? Everybody's for democracy. Even autocratic regimes call themselves, the German Democratic People's Republic and this sort of thing. Democracy's been valorized. But our founders were worried that democracy really can so easily degenerate into the rule of the mob. And for that reason, they decided to establish not a democracy, but what they preferred to call a republic. It certainly had democratic elements, no question about that. Look at the House of Representatives at the national level. We elect these characters every 2 years. That might be a good or a bad idea. One thing it means is that they're fundraising and running for office from the moment they complete a successful campaign. They're already back at it. But that shows you that democracy is an important part of the American political order. And yet we have what you rightly called a moment ago, a system of checks and balances. In other words, we don't have a direct democracy. We have a deliberative democracy in which we have such things as the separation of powers. We don't concentrate power in, say, one elected ruler or one elected leader. We have a president, that's for sure, and a president has quite a lot of power, especially in his or her role as commander in chief. But the president is checked by the Congress and can be checked, of course, by the courts as well. Same with the Congress. I mean, there are checks on congressional power. There are limitations, of course, on judicial power. Now, power can be abused by any of the branches and has been abused by all of the branches. But those checks are in there so that democracy does not become the rule of the mob and start transgressing people's basic rights, basic civil liberties. And I'll just conclude this little soliloquy by reminding everybody that our Bill of Rights was a set of amendments. Now, why was that?
Yeah.
Did they forget about rights? Did they forget about civil liberties and had to say, oh, wait a minute, we forgot. A couple of years later, we have to fix this. No, they didn't. They preferred to protect liberty by checking power. And the Bill of Rights represents a kind of a belt to go along with the suspenders way of protecting basic liberties that you have in the actual body of the Constitution, with our distinction, for example, between the national government as a government of delegated and enumerated powers, and our state governments as governments of general jurisdiction exercising plenary authority, police powers to protect public health, safety, and morals, and to advance the common good, or the separation of the executive and legislative and judicial branches and the separation of their powers. The founders believed that the way to protect liberty and to prevent the republic from degenerating into tyranny was to make sure nobody had unchecked power and nobody had unaccountable power. It's checks on power, it's accountability that are the primary protections for liberty. And then we back it up with a judicially enforceable Bill of Rights.
If I can add something to that very learned disquisition, and by the way, I want to add to your kind thanks to Monica and me, Robbie. Thank you to you for being a leader in not only exercising and defending free speech in an ideologically neutral fashion, but in fostering the ability to engage in robust but civil discourse with people with whom we disagree through the wonderful Madison Project. I think
Well,
it was
thank you.
the very first such institution. Now, fortunately, many other campuses are following suit. But at the time that was created, you were like a voice in the wilderness. And really addressing what the whole topic of this session is, that we begin to overcome polarization at the national level by overcoming it at the individual and community level, right? I think that was part of the description of this event, Monica. And since the whole series of webinars is based on the Declaration of Independence, I do want to go back to the language, because the Declaration of Independence laid out what the philosophy and mission of our government was. The Constitution is a blueprint, if you will, for creating a structure to pursue that mission and that purpose. But I think, as all of us, I hope all of us learned in grade school, I'm sure it's part of the FAIR's curriculum, the Declaration of Independence famously says that we are all created equal and have unalienable rights, that it is the purpose of government to secure these rights. Likewise, so rights are not created by the Constitution or by any law. They are considered to be innate, God-given, or, by nature's God, if you're more of a secular humanist. And that the purpose of government is to protect those rights from any threat. And the threat is not only from a monarch or from a single despotic tyrant, but also from what Madison and others called the potential tyranny of the majority. So I just want to underscore that we are not a pure democracy, that from the beginning, the founders recognized that there are certain rights that are so fundamental that no majority, no matter how large, can take them away from any minority. The Constitution repeated that fundamental idea in the preamble, where it recites the purposes of the government, one of which is to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, not to provide them, not to grant them, not to create them, but to secure these pre-existing liberties.
God, that's
Monica,
really
if I can chime in on something that Nadine
yeah.
said, because now I want to italicize, underscore what she said. I've been teaching civil liberties and constitutional interpretation at Princeton for about 40 years. And over that entire period, I've noticed that there's an idea that seems to have seeped into the public consciousness that there's some sort of a conflict, or at least a tension, between the Declaration of Independence, that the Declaration represented a certain perspective, which then got abandoned, and we replaced it with the perspective of the Constitution. And I've wrestled with that, trying to figure out where that's coming from, because it is certainly not true. I mean, Nadine had it exactly right. What the Constitution does is provide the mechanisms for effectuating the principles of the Declaration. There's absolutely no conflict between the proposition that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And as Nadine goes on to quote, and it's for the securing of these rights that governments are instituted among men. There's no distinction between that and we the people, the first three words of the Constitution, setting forth the goals of establishing justice, the national security, the prosperity and happiness of the people, and so forth. And then setting into place a system of checks and balances, a system of federalism, and then attaching a Bill of Rights to protect these fundamental liberties. So there's not only is there not a conflict, there's not a tension. These are part of the same project.
And I would say the Bill of Rights is simply it's like a belt and suspenders approach to protecting liberty, right? Because the framers believed from the beginning that there would be freedom of speech, that the national government would not be empowered to limit speech, for example, because that was not one of the limited and enumerated powers that were delegated to it. But in an excess of caution, and there can be no such thing as an excess of caution in terms of protecting individual liberty, not only are the Bill of Rights added, but in another excess of caution to refute the possible implication that only the rights that are expressly articulated are the ones that exist. We, of course, have the Ninth Amendment saying that's not true.
That's right.
So I love this belt and suspenders analogy now, because it really gets into something that I think one of the inspirations for FAIR's curriculum is that our foundational principles are under attack, and that's because what we're seeing now, and what we've actually seen throughout American history, is that there can be profoundly different interpretations of the same founding document. So the belt, and accusations that the belt doesn't always fit the suspenders, or vice versa, or it's coming off. And I'll just an example that comes to the top of my mind is the tension. You talked about tension between all men are created equal and slavery and the Three-Fifths Compromise, right? So do these interpretational differences, or ambiguity, do they reveal fundamental weaknesses in our democratic republic, or is this ambiguity actually a strength that serves us? Nadine, why don't you take that first since
Okay, well, obviously, there's a blatant contradiction between
yeah.
the aspirational ideal, that's the way I take the Declaration
Hmm.
of Independence, of equality for all people, and the existence of not only a slave system, but many other blatant inequalities, starting with who is eligible to vote. And to my mind, well, first of all, this illustrates that we had deep divisions in this country from the very beginning, at least as deep as the divisions today. In fact, today I can't imagine even the most, extreme white supremacist advocating a system of enslavement. So, in that sense, our differences today are relatively small, even over a contentious issue. But the lesson that I draw from the inherent inconsistencies in the Constitution itself is that there is a mechanism for compromise. I mean, the compromises were deemed necessary in order to create the United States at all. And I am not a historian. I should have started with that disclaimer, but I'm interested enough in history to know that they're very serious, respected historians argue that in the long run, which is, the perspective we have now, that it was better that that compromise was reached, that it enabled the creation of a republic that ultimately led to the abolition of enslavement and the struggle against Jim Crow, and that although we were light years away from the founding principles of liberty and justice for all when those words were penned by Thomas Jefferson, that we have become closer and closer to achieving them. Still a lot of work to do, but we should be encouraged by the progress that we have made. And the Constitution itself provides the tools for achieving that change, that positive reform, not only through the voting, not only through free speech, but also through the process of amending the Constitution. Slavery was ultimately abolished through an amendment to the Constitution.
Robbie, you have
Yeah,
anything to
that
add?
no, that all sounds right to me. I just offer a few reflections. The decision on the part of those opposed to slavery at the time of the founding to join with those who supported slavery, pardon me, so that the republic could be established was not an easy decision. It was probably, though, the right decision for the reasons that Nadine articulated there. It put into place a structure, a civic order that was incompatible with slavery
Mhm.
and put slavery ultimately on the road to extinction. Now, unfortunately, it cost a bloody civil war
Mhm.
to do that. I think we all wish that it could have been accomplished without that carnage, an unbelievable carnage, 750,000 men dead, according to my very distinguished Civil War historian colleague, Jim McPherson, in a population of what, I guess 29 million or something like that. I mean, it's unbelievable carnage. But people like Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, who were opposed to slavery, were willing to set that issue aside in order to found the republic. Now, notice though, when I say set it aside, they mean set it aside. They
Mhm.
would not accept a constitution that incorporated and protected slavery. Notice that the word is never used in the Constitution.
Mhm. Mhm.
They agreed to just avoid the issue altogether. Second point, even many of the people who supported slavery or opposed abolition, you can start this list with figures like Washington and Jefferson. Okay, even those who supported slavery, indeed, even those who owned slaves like Washington and Jefferson, knew it was wrong.
Mm,
They knew it was wrong.
that's a good point.
They didn't think they could get rid of it. They thought the costs of getting rid of it would be too high,
Mhm.
unpayable, unacceptable.
Mhm.
But they did hope, and many believed that things would turn out such that without bloodshed, slavery would die a natural death. It was Jefferson, Monica, who said, these are his words, speaking about slavery. that I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that his justice will not sleep forever.
Mm.
That's how bad he thought slavery was, that the judgment of God will come down on the nation for it. And of course, if Lincoln's to be believed in his second inaugural address, that is exactly what happened. In that
Mhm.
address, Lincoln says straight up, slavery was a sin, and God punished both the North and the South with the carnage of the war as a punishment for that sin. Now, the trouble was, people like Jefferson also believed, if I can quote him again, that slavery is like having a wolf by the ears. You know you can't hold it forever, but you dare not let go.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Interesting. You know,
So, what happens? Well, what happens is the deal doesn't hold. I mean, they could not make a lasting compromise that would hold, in part because of technological developments. People like Jefferson and Washington, who thought slavery would die a natural economic death, didn't reckon on the creation of technologies that would give it a new life and make it very economically practical. And that's, I think, why at the end of the day, we ended up with a civil war before we could amend the Constitution to prohibit slavery. The other thing I think everybody's got to remember, just ask yourselves this question, everybody out there, isn't it true at all times and all places, almost by definition, that the most entrenched injustices in a society, people in the society, all except the victims, are blind to? That's the human condition. You just
yes.
don't see it. You just don't see it. And slavery was, after all, the norm, not the exception in human history. Over time, across cultures, it wasn't aberrant. It was the opposite of aberrant. It was the norm. We should actually congratulate those who did take the unusual step of acting to abolish slavery, of sacrificing, of in some cases sacrificing their lives to get rid of slavery.
You know, Monica, your initial question was broader than slavery, which is, I think, the most blatant contradiction between the ideals of liberty and equality and the Declaration of Independence. But you asked a more general question first, which is, aren't there different interpretations of the Constitution? And yes, there are. I don't see that as a bad thing at all. It reflected not only compromise, so there are some tensions among all of the different provisions, but it also reflects the innate imprecision of language, the fact that to some extent the framers deliberately used vague, open-ended terms precisely. Well, here we could get into debate perhaps between originalists and others, but it has been argued, including by the great early Supreme Court Justice Marshall, that many of the provisions were written in deliberately open-ended terms in order to allow the Constitution to be interpreted in accordance with changing developments, changing economic, social, cultural, technological developments. Also, people with different perspectives. I've already alluded to the fact that an originalist might take a different approach to interpreting a constitutional provision from a so-called, evolving constitutionalist. And I think all of that is healthy for precisely the reason that we value debate and discourse across different perspectives, as FAIR certainly has championed, as the Madison Project that Robbie co-founded has championed, recognizing that all of us have our own cognitive biases and limitations that we can evolve to a better understanding as a society as we debate the various possible interpretations. And specifically on the issue of slavery versus liberty, one of the greatest constitutional scholars, not to mention one of the greatest activists of all time, Frederick Douglass, himself went through a very profound evolution, right?
That's right.
He first bemoaned and decried the Constitution as anti-liberty, I think best known in his famous address, What to a Slave is the 4th of July. But after further study and contemplation, he came to arrive at Lincoln's position that the Constitution, together with the Declaration of Independence, should be seen as a pro-liberty, anti-slavery document. And in fact, it was cited very effectively by the abolitionists as well as by the civil rights movement in the next century.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'd like to. We really dug into that topic pretty deeply. I'm going to pivot now to e pluribus unum, the challenge of forming one from many, which is critical to our pluralistic society. And it actually evolved from the original 13 colonies, which were diverse even back then. Diverse meaning not demographically necessarily, but they had very different ways of moving through the world, especially the northern colonies and the southern colonies. But the religious, if I'm recalling correctly, the Religious Freedom Act of 1786 in Virginia took what was, I think back then, the revolutionary step of protecting religious pluralism through law. So rather than demanding religious uniformity, the law recognized that allowing diverse religious expression didn't weaken the Commonwealth, but actually strengthened it. So even back then, I mean, there's a lot of pushback on diversity now. But even back then, our founders acknowledged that, look, most of us are Christian, or most of us are Protestant, or most of us, whatever, flee from the Church of England, maybe Puritan or whatever. But we acknowledge diverse religious expression is essential. So I'm wondering, are there other historical examples of successful pluralism that you can think of, Robbie, that we can keep in mind to guide our efforts of maintaining unity without demanding uniformity? I think that's the biggest challenge we face right now, and what's putting so much pressure in our schools in particular, is that it's been very difficult to keep us together as Americans, but still acknowledging that we're not all alike. We don't always have to think the same way and believe the same thing, the same religion, the same whatever, have the same social mores, but we can still be united as one. I'd like to know if you can think of any historical precedent that would give us hope, because I think that's what people want now. Hope that even though we're different, we can still come together.
Well, I'm afraid, Monica, that our nation, is really the pioneer of the kind of pluralism that you're talking about. There are not a lot of other historical examples of people living together in peace and in equality,
Yeah.
where they have deep differences of religion, morality, politics, and so forth. And there are many, many examples, of course, of people apparently living together in peace and even some measure of harmony for decades, sometimes more than decades, and then suddenly an
Yeah.
eruption of evil and murder. I mean, think of the Tutsis and the Hutus
Mhm.
had lived together side by side, generations in peace, and then it all blew up. I speaking now with my sort of political philosopher hat on rather than my constitutional lawyer one, um, I would say it's important for us to acknowledge that to have a community of any sort, and certainly to have a civic community, to have a polity, there needs to be some basis of strength and unity. There's got to be some sharing. There's got to be some shared belief. For a lot of history, a lot of people thought, well, the shared belief you need is religious belief. If you
Mhm.
want people to live together in peace and harmony, they have to believe the same things about the most important stuff, the
Mhm.
deepest stuff. But America said, well, no, you need some shared beliefs, but you can have religious pluralism.
Mhm.
And I think we proved our point on that. In fact, you can have lots of other differences, differences of ethnicity, differences of race, differences of cultural background, differences of all sorts of traditions. We bet in this country, this is what American exceptionalism, you've heard that phrase, I'm sure, that
Yeah.
term.
Yeah.
This is what it's all about. For most of our history, we've understood that we need some source of strength and unity. There needs to be some shared belief. And the shared belief we have made the foundation of our strength and unity is belief in the basic principles of the civic order, the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution. whether you're Protestant or Catholic, Christian or Jewish, Buddhist, Muslim, Hindu, secular, whatever you are, if you sign on to the American creed, which is a civic, not a religious creed, the principle of unalienable rights, rights that don't come from government. You might disagree about where they come from, but you agree they don't come from government. So government can't take them away. Government can't legitimately violate them. And the principles of the Constitution, the principles of Republican government, that will be the sharing. It's thin, but we bet the ranch that despite the fact that it's being thin, it's not all the thick stuff, God, culture, history. Despite its being thin, we bet that it's enough. And so far, it has been enough. Nadine, you might recall that we're celebrating the 70th anniversary of that great book by the great Jewish thinker Will Herberg, Protestant Catholic Jew. And it was largely about the way American Protestants, Catholics, and Jews accomplished something that the Europeanists, their co-religionists in Europe, Protestants and Catholic Jews, couldn't accomplish. Living together in peace as fellow citizens, cooperating, not just staying out of each other's hair, actually cooperating to build a civic order. Now the question, Monica, to me is, can we sustain it? Now it's under real stress. Do we still have enough sharing? If we lose our shared faith in the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution, given that we're different races, different ethnicities, different histories and cultural backgrounds, different religions, different in every other way, if we lose that shared belief in the principles of the civic order, I don't see what's left. How can you have a community?
You know,
Yeah.
I agree with what Robbie said, but I also, and we're talking about, and you use the wonderful phrase, Monica, unity without uniformity. We're talking about unity coexisting with diversity, right? Diversity of thought, diversity of belief, diversity of identity, diversity of ideas. And yet we are unified in sharing some fundamental principles. And here again, I want to come back to that interesting point you raised, Monica. Well, what about the different interpretations? I would say, vive les différences, right? To borrow from the French, because we don't want to be cookie cutters. We don't want to be indoctrinated in this is the way you must interpret the Declaration or a particular passage in the Constitution. We have to dig deep to fundamental principles or concepts such as, liberty and justice and equality. And all of us will interpret the details, important details, in different ways and have very vigorous debates about them. But I think it would be tragic if we abandoned these core overarching notions and the aspirations that were so eloquently set forth in the Declaration as the founding creed of our country. Now, a phrase that I have no idea who said it. I wish I could attribute it to somebody because I think it's so wonderful. But here's what he or she said, that when we look at the founders, we should focus not on their blind spots, but on their vision, right? The larger vision, these larger grand ideals and aspirations. They were human beings. They were outstanding in many ways, but they were as flawed as the rest of us. But we should not be blinded by their blind spots. We should look beyond that to the larger, really inspiring purpose. And I hope we can use that same approach in taking very seriously the differences with our fellow citizens, but never losing sight of the really strong, powerful bonds that should continue to unite us.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%, Nadine. Let's look at what the alternative is. The alternative to a republic like ours, a pluralistic republic like ours, where what the sources of our strength and unity really are in our shared principles, the civic order principles. If you look at Europe, if you look at Asia, you look at anywhere else, basically nations, peoples, sources of strength and unity are either blood or soil or throne or altar, or some combination of blood and soil and throne and altar. That's not us. That's why we're exceptional. It's not that there's something in principle wrong with building a society on other kinds of common bonds, but
Mhm.
we can't because we don't have those bonds. We are different races, different religions, different ethnicities, different traditions, different historical and cultural backgrounds. That's why we have to nurture and preserve and uphold to pass on the sources of strength and unity that we do have in the principles of our civic order.
Well, I'm going to I'm going to pull on this thread and dig a bit deeper into the tension between unity and uniformity by bringing it into sort of current events.
Mhm.
So, New York City may be a week away from having its first socialist mayor, or according to some communist. I mean, we're hearing both. It's unclear whether Zoran Mamdani is socialist or communist. I'm still not clear on it. Now, you both made a great point about the coexistence of unity and diversity, but I'm wondering how far we can extend this. Much of the opposition that Mamdani has received, not just from Republicans, but within his own party, stems from the fact that his values may, not just social, but mostly economic, may conflict with the foundational values of most Americans. So, do you think a Mamdani victory, if he wins next week, will this test the limits of America's unity, ability to be unified without uniformity?
Monica,
Ladies first.
what
Oh, ladies first.
what I find so interesting about that, especially because we were just talking about religion, is you didn't note that he would be the first Muslim mayor of New York.
That's right.
You know,
You're
but
right.
I
Yeah.
think I think that speaks volumes because we have come, Robbie talked about how innovative it was that Catholics and Jews and Protestants could work together, but Muslims, Hindus, atheists, throw in a whole lot of other Buddhists, etc. I think maybe that's only true in New York, but I think I've traveled a lot around the hinterland, and we have much more acceptance of broad religious diversity, including Muslims. I'm not going to take an opinion on how to accurately characterize his economic policies, but there's absolutely no doubt that you have the right not only to advocate communism and socialism, but even to advocate the overthrow of the United States government.
Yeah.
That is what the Supreme Court has held unanimously since 1969, overturning old cases in which socialists and communists and anarchists were punished because of the danger that their advocacy could lead to
Mhm.
the overthrow. And even way back then in dissent, Oliver Wendell Holmes said, well, if that's where debate leads, that's the consequence of what our Constitution set up, allowing free debate and free
Yeah.
elections.
That's an excellent point. Robbie, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, it's a democracy. It's a republic, strictly
Yeah.
speaking. But the citizens of New York have the right to cast their ballots for who they want, and they'll get the consequences of that and have to live with the consequences of that. If it's Mr. Mamdani and he decides he's going to, socialize grocery sales in New York, I have a pretty good idea of what the consequences of that will be for the citizens of New York. It'd be very bad. But the people of New York, by their votes, will have brought it on themselves. I think remind me, Nadine, if I'm wrong about that. I think it was Oliver Wendell Holmes who said that people have a right to go to hell in their own way, and it's my
Yeah,
job as a Supreme
yeah.
Court justice to help them get there.
And we,
So there are consequences. I mean,
you know,
that's the way this works. There are consequences. You live with the consequences.
Yes.
there may be other examples, but I know from my Minnesota history, which I had to take when I was a grade school student in Minnesota, that the city of Duluth, Minnesota had communists a communist mayor and a majority of the city council. And in fact, to this day, Minnesota does not have a Democratic Party. It has something called the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, which
Right.
Hubert Humphrey founded as an alternative because the socialists were so strong throughout the state. So we do have, at least in one state, and I'm sure in others, precedents of communists and socialists being elected to high office. And the Republic
Yeah.
did not dissolve in Minnesota or elsewhere.
Yeah,
I think a
mean,
lot of people,
yeah, go
yes,
ahead.
go ahead, Robbie. Oh,
Yeah,
no, no. I just think that's something that I think a lot of people will need to hear, because there's a decent amount of fear and alarm, not just in New York, but beyond New York now. And I think there's a concern that this is going to set off a wave of, communist or socialist mayors. No one cares about Muslim mayor at this point, I don't think, or very few people do. I think the bigger concern is communism or socialism. But thank you so much for reminding us of that there's precedent for where we are now. I think the fact that a lot of times we forget where we've come from and the precedent, and our lack of history makes us leaves us a little vulnerable and unprepared to handle certain events. So it's really good to have that perspective, Nadine. Anyway, Robbie, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one problem that you have in New York, and you have it in other places, and it can be true on either side of the ideological spectrum, is basically you've got a one-party system in New York. You don't have a
Yeah.
competitive second party. When I was growing up as a boy in West Virginia, we had the same issue, but it was the Democratic. Well, it was the same party actually, the Democratic Party that had monopoly on things. There was essentially no Republican Party. We did occasionally have a Republican governor somehow, just the same way you occasionally could get a Republican mayor like Giuliani in New York. But as I recall the Giuliani case, it was only when things got really, really bad that people said, "Gosh, we can't continue down the path we're going." And so, aberrationally, they elect a Republican reformer. But it would be better for the country if we had truly competitive
Sure.
elections in all of our cities and all of our counties and all of our congressional districts. And we have less and less competitive races and
Yeah.
fewer competitive races at all of those different levels. And I don't think that's good for the Republic.
I
Yeah.
completely agree.
Um,
Monica, if I could,
yes.
develop a point that you commented on
Mm.
before Robbie spoke, and that is that, when people talk about the dangers of polarization today, and I think they are severe, but I
Mm.
think it's important to have two historical contexts, or I guess two conclusions from the historical context. And the two conclusions I draw are, number one, how unpolarized or less polarized things were allegedly in the past. That's exaggerated. And
Yeah.
how super polarized things are today is also exaggerated. In other words, I think there's less dissimilarity
Yeah.
between today and past times. So, we've talked about the Civil War obviously being the most
It's the
dramatic
worst. Yeah.
conflagration, but there were so many, many other periods in our history where we were deeply divided. I think it's well known that the Gilded Age, and then the 20s, and the civil
Civil
rights
rights movement. Yeah.
movement. In my own, we now look back on the civil rights movement as an era where goals that are so widely shared were fostered, but people don't remember. And I keep telling myself this can't be true, so I looked it up again. When Martin Luther King was assassinated, he had a 75% unfavorability view in the United. 75% of
No.
Americans, not just in the South, had a negative view of him, and that was more than
No.
one poll. So, ideas changed, but then after that we had the Watergate era. Well, no,
Yeah.
after that, or at about the same time, during the Vietnam era, and I think it was King's views on Vietnam that were very polarizing. The term was used, the generation gap, that young people and
Yes.
older people couldn't speak to each other. On the
That's where the
other,
Gap comes from. That's where the Gap comes
exactly.
from. The clothing company, by the way, is named
Are
after the
you
generation.
serious?
Oh,
I
I
had
didn't know
no
that.
Absolutely.
Isn't
idea.
that
That's right.
interesting?
Yep.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. Wow.
Yeah.
But,
You know, oh, go ahead,
Oh,
Nadine.
sorry.
just the other point, there's one of a number of organizations that drill down on the second part of the point that I was making, that we're not really that polarized today. We may have an exaggerated view of it. There's an organization called More in Common, which has put out,
Yeah,
many studies, starting with the first major one in 2018 called Hidden Tribes, which
that's
show
right.
that the air in the political debates and in the media is given pretty much to 8% on one side
Yep.
and 6% on the other side. But most people are somewhere in the middle and are hungering for negotiation and compromise, and who really share these fundamental underlying values, including of democracy and the Constitution.
I'm a little more inclined in the direction of believing that we are very dangerously polarized at the moment. But I agree fully with the other point that you made, Nadine, which is that this is not unique. And it's not just, as you say, the Civil War. That was the worst moment of polarization, and the country barely survived. But there have been other points. You mentioned a number of them. The one that I think is most like our current situation, it was the most dangerous one in our history, was in 1800. It was the election of 1800.
Oh,
That's when the Federalists had power. John Adams was in the White House, and they were being challenged by the Democratic Republicans, also known as the Jeffersonians. And it was a bitter, bitter election. The
mhm.
vitriol, the hatred, the defamation running in both
Mhm. Mhm.
directions. Fellow citizens can't walk down the street with each other if one's on the Federalist
Wow.
side of the spectrum and the other's on the Jeffersonian side. And there was a real concern that if the Federalists lost the election, they wouldn't give up the White House, that they wouldn't leave.
Mhm.
And of course, we had no precedent then
Mhm.
of a peaceful transfer of power between parties in a
Mhm.
democracy. It hadn't happened in all history, really.
Mhm.
So it was an open question. And God bless John Adams
Mhm.
because he did the right thing. When he lost, he left. The
Mhm.
Jefferson became president. The Democratic Republicans also took the Congress. There was a peaceful transfer of power, but it was by no means a foregone conclusion.
Mhm.
Could very easily, everything could have gone up in smoke right then.
Mhm. Mhm.
You know, I listened to you. You guys have such amazing historical knowledge. I totally forgot about the election you just mentioned, Robbie. And God, Nadine, I'd never heard of that poll, the 75% poll with MLK. I just assumed that the nation was pretty evenly split, and that it was the Southerners who objected to the civil rights movement, and like with slavery, like I thought
Yeah,
the
but not,
North
but
and everyone
there was
else
a lot of opposition to abolitionists in the North. I mean,
in
it
the
was
North
in
too.
Boston that Frederick Douglass was shouted down and deplatformed from trying to address an abolition meeting.
So,
Boston, Faneuil Hall.
All places.
yeah, I mean, you
So
got to
we,
understand me, to move ahead back up to the 60s, Martin Luther King was not universally popular among Black Americans.
Yeah, that's
this
true.
is
We've
crazy.
lost, now we have the King holiday, and of course, there was
Yeah.
the tragedy of his assassination and martyrdom and so forth. But that's, I think, caused a certain kind of forgetfulness of what the
Mm.
situation actually was for King and for his movement in 1968.
I mean, this is such valuable perspective because I think a lot of people, the old phrase, those who forget history or ignore history are doomed to repeat it. I think we've just forgotten our history. And Robbie, when you talk about the Civil War, the Gilded Age, the Red Scare, and indeed the Civil
Yeah.
Rights Movement, we have been through so much more and managed to survive. And I sometimes think, and this is me talking as a Gen Xer who
Mm.
narrowly missed the Civil Rights Movement, I often think I grew up in an era of relative quiescence, didn't have any world wars. There was no real
Yeah.
social upheaval, a few light protests for, the gay and lesbian and bisexual community, but nothing really substantial. Even economically, it's been pretty, it was just pretty quiet. And then all of a sudden we lose that 20 or 25 or 30-year period of quiescence, and now we're in the thick of it again. And
Mm.
we've lost our memory of like, this is actually it's when you think about it and you really pull focus on America during its entire history, most of its history
Mhm.
has been a lot of turmoil and unrest, and that maybe not unrest, but a lot of polarization, and we forget that. And thank you so much for reminding us of this.
Well, and
Here's something.
the outcome of many of those polarizing struggles is not only a return to a more peaceful polity, but also very often progress toward those goals of liberty and
Yes,
justice for all.
yes.
Another thing that I think it's really important to remember is reasonable people of goodwill, even those who share some very fundamental values, can have very important differences
Hmm.
about how we should go about even the project of reform, or what is in need of reform and what's actually not in need of reform. Everybody seems to be familiar. My students, when they come to Princeton, know that Martin Luther King wrote a letter from Birmingham jail, and it's a famous piece of American political writing. And they seem to have an idea that the letter was directed against a group of people who'd criticized King, and that's all true. There were 8 clergymen, and they had criticized King for bringing his protests to Birmingham.
Oh, yeah.
So a lot of my students, this is interesting, Mike, a lot of my students assume that those 8, as it turns out, they were clergymen, the 8 clergymen that King is responding to, they must be terrible
Right.
racists. They were the racists. And so King was answering. No. In fact, if they just read the letter a little more carefully, they'll find King commending and praising one of the people he's responding to for courageously integrating his church. They were enemies of Jim Crow. They weren't friends. Their issue was, does it make sense? Is it good for the community? Is it good for the cause for King to bring his protesters down who would be
Hmm.
violently attacked? They would practice nonviolence, but there
Hmm.
would be violence, and that
Hmm.
violence would actually be politically useful to King because it would be on the TVs. And so people around the
Hmm.
country would see the dogs and the fire hoses unleashed on these
Yeah.
little children and innocent people. And that could move the Kennedy administration, which was looking to 1964 and didn't want to do a civil rights act because they needed to carry at least one, probably 2 southern states to win. It would get the Kennedy administration, it would put pressure, public pressure on them to actually move the cause of civil rights forward.
Hmm.
So King is responding not to racists who disagree with his advocacy of justice, but to people who are on his side who disagree with his way of pursuing the cause. And those are legitimate disagreements.
But there were
Yeah,
there were legitimate disagreements from the opposite perspective, right? Who
Absolutely.
attacked him for being too mild-mannered and not
Uh,
confrontational enough.
Malcolm
Cornell
X.
West and I in the
There we go.
seminar we teach together always play there's a wonderful video of Malcolm X's speech. He never mentions Martin Luther King by name. It's come to be known as the House Negro speech. He doesn't mention Martin Luther King by name, but he ridicules King, basically accusing him of being an Uncle Tom, precisely because he was not a Malcolm X by any means necessary type, more radical or revolutionary advocate.
Mhm.
I just have to say, in defense of Uncle Tom, he was no Uncle Tom. Seriously.
That's true. That's
I
true.
mean,
Yeah,
that's a whole other subject. But
that's
again,
another
the
that's another
conventional
issue.
wisdom. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's where
he's
people,
gotten
you
an
don't really, they don't,
unjustified bad name.
absolutely not a real Uncle Tom. I have a question from the one of our viewers. What positive examples of interlocutors who disagree have most influenced you? So just looking back historically, um, inspirations for you.
Well, just off
Nadine, yeah,
Well,
yes.
Robert George and Cornell West.
Oh,
I
okay.
mean, they are
Thank you.
absolutely amazing. I have watched countless of their exchanges with each other. Each one is so inspiring and, just such and it's a wonderful resource that people can easily find online. This summer, I had the first opportunity ever to see it in person, so I strongly recommend that even more. But let me give another really inspiring, more historic inspiring example that I only learned of fairly recently, and I'm sure many people don't know about it.
Hmm.
And that was George Wallace, the famous
Oh, yeah.
segregationist governor of Alabama, segregation now, segregation forever. And
Mhm.
Shirley Chisholm, the first Black woman member of Congress, right? And certainly the first Black female candidate for president, when she was running in the California primary, and Wallace was also running for president, he was shot by an attempted assassin and very severely injured in the hospital. She suspended her campaign in California to go visit him in his hospital somewhere on the East Coast. And her campaign staff were just outraged. How can you do this? But she was a devout Christian. She believed very strongly in, humanity and reaching out to people despite differences. And it's a very detailed, interesting story, but the bottom line is it had a profound impact in changing his views. And when he subsequently ran again for governor of Alabama, he got something like 80% of the Black vote. And he
Oh,
did
wow.
amazing things for Black people in Alabama. I didn't know any of that
Wait,
either. Yeah, I
George
know.
Yeah,
Wallace, who
George
changed
Wallace.
yeah,
himself?
Yes,
This is
yes,
the same man who okay.
yes,
Wow, I
yes.
did not know
You
that.
yeah,
have to read
that's
about
absolutely
this.
right.
It's not nearly as well known as it should be. And I think her outreach, as well as that of Black churches that he visited, really changed
What?
his heart, changed his mind. Yes.
Oh, yeah,
Oh,
he
that's
did.
mind-blowing. I did
Yeah.
not know that at all.
I would cite the case of Justice Antonin Scalia and Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Tomorrow, I'm going to be teaching Nadine the VMI case, U.S. versus
Oh, yeah.
Virginia, 1996. And Scalia was the sole dissenter in that case. It was about whether VMI could remain all male, and the court ruled that it can't, that it has to admit women. Scalia dissented, but he submitted his dissent very early to Justice Ginsburg so that she could have it and take it on board and write the best possible response to him.
Oh,
And she later said that while she didn't agree with a word that Scalia said, that it was nevertheless a very powerful and compelling dissent, and that her majority opinion was much improved by having had the opportunity to wrestle with his arguments and plenty of time to wrestle with him. If we go back deeper into history, this isn't a debating pair, but it's a really interesting case. The Confederate general, Joe Johnson, at the end of the war, befriended, of all people, are you ready? William
hmm.
Tecumseh Sherman. And in fact, they became such close friends that not only was Johnson invited to the funeral of Sherman, he was invited to be one of the pallbearers. And it was a cold day, and he didn't wear a hat. And one of the men who was there with the entourage said, General Johnson, it's very cold out here. You should have a hat on. And he said, if our roles were reversed, if I were in that coffin and Sherman were here, he would have his hat off for me. And
Oh, wow.
a few weeks later, Johnson died uh, of pneumonia. Which he very well might have caught when he was standing out there in the
Oh,
cold as a very old man. So
Wow.
there's some extraordinary cases like that in history. The case of Abraham Lincoln and Joshua Speed.
mhm.
Joshua Speed, Lincoln's best friend, a defender of slavery, a slaveholder for Lincoln's entire life, his best friend. They deeply disagreed. Lincoln once said he had to crucify himself to not constantly make it an issue with Speed. But nevertheless, the great emancipator had as his best friend a supporter of slavery and a holder of slaves.
Let me mention just one other example, which something Robbie said earlier adverted to, and that was Thomas Jefferson and John Adams.
Oh, yeah.
Obviously, they collaborated early on in the founding era, but then became bitter enemies and, in fact, did not
1800.
speak for at least 20 years, not a single word exchanged between them. And
Wow.
then one of them, I believe it was Jefferson, reached out to Adams, sent a letter, and Adams responded very cordially. And for the last remainder of their lives, they corresponded back and forth very intimately about personal issues, political issues, again, reverting to, not papering over the very strong disagreements, but emphasizing the shared common commitments that had initially brought them together.
And to add to the magnificence of the story,
Yes,
on July 4th, 1826,
yes.
People
when
died.
John Adams was drawing his last breath, his final words were, Jefferson lives. But it wasn't true. because a few hours earlier on that same day, 50 years to the day of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson had died.
Oh my God, they were soulmates. They
Yeah,
had
they
to
were
have.
soulmates.
I mean, these are such inspirational like stories, and I just wonder. And you're talking about some of the most powerful men and women in America's history. I'm sure a lot of them with egos who managed to overcome their differences, set them aside. And I'm just wondering what has changed now, because even amongst family members, brothers, sisters, mothers, daughters, friends, I've lost so many friends over the last 3 years having these very difficult conversations. What do we lack now that people, great people, had back then? And this is the last question, but I think it's a great one to end on. You know, what was there something different about the American sensibility that allowed us to respect our basic human dignity and humanity in order to overcome ideology? How are we able to do it then, but we have such trouble doing it now?
Monica, what I observe, I'm not going to say what was different. Well, I'm going to come at it from this perspective.
Okay.
What I have observed recently that I had not seen in my lifetime, either among public figures or among social people we socialize with, and that is this demand of absolute agreement on a whole range of issues, and kind of a litmus test, but a very expansive litmus test. I may agree with you on 9/10 of the issues that we hold most important, but if you disagree with me on one, you are a non-person. And one very dramatic example of that, that sadly has been very prevalent, is on Israel Palestine, where we
Sure.
see campus organizations basically excommunicating Jews or Zionists or Israelis and saying you can't participate in this human rights coalition, or you can't be part of our women's rights group or our LGBTQ group if you support Israel. And we've seen that not only on campus, but also in, adult organizations like the Women's March, right?
Yeah.
Famously in Washington, D.C. And I don't know what explains that. Often the term intersectionality is thrown around, but I'm told that it's, being used to exactly the opposite effect of what Kimberly Crenshaw, the progenitor of the concept, wanted it to be used. But that seems to me to explain, not to justify, a lot of the extreme siloing that's going on now.
Mm. What do you think, Robbie?
Well, there certainly has been a loss of people's sense of their own fallibility. I don't know where people got it into their heads that they're infallible, but a lot of people simply won't tolerate being criticized or having a view of theirs criticized or having a view of theirs challenged. Part of it, I think, might be the rise, and now you're seeing it on the conservative side, not just on the left, of
Mhm.
identitarian politics.
Yeah.
And once you identify yourself so strongly with a set of convictions, you wrap your emotions so tightly around the convictions that you hold. Once you get yourself into that situation, you will perceive the expression of a difference of opinion not as, well, a difference of opinion by somebody who disagrees, who's thought about it and come to a different conclusion. You'll experience it as a personal assault. Well, if you disagree with me on this racial question or on some question of sexual ethics or morality, then you're attacking me personally, and I'm going to consider you the enemy. And my goal is not to engage with you or argue with you. My goal is to defeat you or destroy you. So I think what we need to recover, Monica, is just a sense of our own fallibility, the recognition that we can be wrong, all of us, and not just about the minor, superficial, trivial things of life. We can be wrong about the big, important questions, which means that we need to be open to challenges, to people actually contesting what we say.
Mhm.
And we can't take it as a personal attack on us if people disagree with us.
Yeah.
We should see
Great
it as an
point.
opportunity to learn and maybe to change our
Exactly.
minds.
No,
Yeah, maybe it's a
exactly right. I mean, don't
lack
all of, at
lack
least
of
most of us,
intellectual curiosity. Yeah.
yeah, oh yeah.
I
I
was
mean,
going to
for
say a
one thing,
lack
you
of
might,
intellectual curiosity.
Yeah, I think that's right, Monica. I mean, at a minimum, you should be curious if a very intelligent person has come to a conclusion different from yours on an important issue. At least you should be curious, like, well, I wonder what the reasons are.
Mhm.
And, it might be that you're going to be surprised because that person has reasons that you never considered before, you never thought about.
Mhm. Interesting. Well, we are over time. I had another 7 questions. We will get to them in the next webinar, but I wanted to thank both of you, our wonderful guests, Nadine Strawson and Professor Robert George. And thank you to all of our attendees for your commitment to civic education, not just for those in high school, but for the adults. We never stop learning. The future of our democratic republic depends on the important work both of you are doing, Nadine and Robbie. So the work you're doing on and off campus, we are so thankful for the gifts you keep giving us. Again, as I mentioned at the top of the hour, tonight's webinar series of Affairs American Experience Curriculum. For those who are interested in learning more about our approach to constitutional education within our curriculum, please visit www.fairforall.org. And I wanted to remind everyone that FAIR exists entirely on goodwill, and we're able to operate solely based on donations from intellectually curious and interested people like all of you attending tonight. We do our best to offer programming and educational content that helps raise awareness, attention, and solutions to what we feel are the most timely and relevant issues facing us. So we hope you'll consider donating to FAIR and joining our pro-human movement to help us keep doing the work you all value. And the links are in the chat. And again, or you can visit www.fairforall.org. And lastly, before we leave, I'm excited to share that FAIR is relaunching its Educators Alliance group next Monday. That's a week from today, November 7th. The group will host a monthly gathering with updates and presentations from FAIR fellows, staff, chapter leaders, and occasional guest speakers. And our goal with this alliance is to equip K through 12 educators with the knowledge, strategies, and community support they need to foster schools that are enriching and free from bias for students and educators. So be sure to keep at our weekly news. Thank you again, Nadine and Robbie, for an incredibly stimulating conversation. I really do hope to have a part 2 of this because there's so much more to learn. And I learned a lot tonight, and I hope you all did too.
Thank you so
and
much,
we'll see you at the
Monica.
next webinar.